and welcome everyone to a very educating show here on Isles Talk. I am with someone who I look towards when it comes to doing the draft every year, when it comes to development, scouting. Um, him and Brad Allen, these guys, all of his guests, rich knowledge, back and forth. Um, I, I'll call him a mentor. He's a mentor of mine. I greatly appreciate the amount of service that he provides to the NHL for this sport and the growing and development of players. He is the author of The Art of Scouting. You can hear him every weekend on Hockey Prospect Radio on Sirius, on the NHL channel, on Sirius XM. He is Shane Malloy. He's also considered by some Islander fans the Mel Kiper of junior hockey. So, Shane, thank you so much for coming on to the show. This is a real treat for me.
I really appreciate it, Paul. Very kind words. Mel's got nicer hair than I do, so so I got to give Mel that. So I appreciate
Yeah.
it. I've been very fortunate. I've been mentored by a lot of great people in the hockey world, from general managers down, especially the scouts. When I first started in 2000, I was mentored by a couple of scouts. One was Patty Janelle. He was a longtime junior coach, up for the Flin Flon Bombers, who was a St. Louis Blues scout at the time, as well as Lauren Davies, who was a longtime scout for the Edmonton Oilers. They're both passed on now. They were the first two gentlemen to help me. So they sat me down and I sat beside them, and they helped, they taught me how to scout. And that it wasn't for them, along with Craig Button, who was really good to me. He was the general manager in Calgary at the time when I first started. And he said, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm writing about prospects for Fox Sports." And he goes, "Well, the best thing you can do is learn how to scout." I'm like, "Well, how do I do that?" Right? There's no manual, there's no school, right? You either have someone help you or you fumble your way through it the best you can. And it's not a profession for the faint of heart, because the probability of you finding players is really, really quite small. Most people may not realize the probability of finding a player that'll play more than 200 games. Like, on league average in the salary cap area is 25%. That's it.
That's
That's
it.
it. That's it. Right. So you go into the draft and you're basically rolling the dice. I mean, of course, it's not as luck oriented as that. There is some luck involved, after you draft that player, however, but it really is an interesting process. From and it's one of the things I'm starting to delve into more, on an academic level. So,
Right.
most people may not realize I'm actually in my finishing up my second year of my PhD, and
Good for
it's
you.
in interdisciplinary studies, and my focus is actually on hockey operations effectiveness. So it's really about, a large part of it is how people make decision making processes, and the different theories behind the different, decision making processes. So it's a fascinating standpoint, because hockey operations is a very challenging vocation to be in. It's not for, like I said, for the faint of heart. There's a lot of missteps along the way, because you're trying to project from a drafting perspective an 18-year-old kid into a 23-year-old man. I have two
Yeah.
boys at home. I have no idea what they're going to be when they get older. So how am I supposed
Right.
to figure out some other kid that
Right.
isn't my kid? So that's a really interesting part of the process, is evaluating what they do on the ice. The mental aspect of it, the emotional aspect of it, background. Um, Really trying to understand them as an individual, as a person, and what attributes and skill sets translates best to the NHL. And I take a lot of the mental and emotional aspects that I utilize and I investigate and research from actually military. So if you look at how, militaries were, would be the United States or Canada or NATO countries, how they select their special forces, and trying to figure out which people are going to be, you know, adaptable and be able to be on, say, for instance, SEAL teams. So SEAL
Right.
Team 6, right? Which type of people? And, in my conversations with, commanders who have gone through some of those processes, one of the interesting things is they always say, I can't tell you who is going to make it, but I can tell you who's not going to make it. really by a lot of not only mental and emotional attributes that they gauge and they judge and they test, but also by the individual.
Right.
It'd be surprising, the people that make it are people that look like you and I. Isn't the star college athlete? He doesn't almost never makes it. It's not the guy who comes in all muscled up and tattoos. They almost never make it. It's usually
Right.
the guy who's 185 pounds soaking wet and has had maybe a tougher upbringing and had to grind his way through school. It's that guy that makes it. Now, we're trying to take those lessons and those processes and put that into evaluation process for when you're trying to evaluate hockey players, because as the talent pool compresses, it just becomes more and more difficult, and it's more reliant upon what's going on between your ears than it is really about your skill set. There's tons of kids that I've seen in junior hockey in the CHL that put up 100 points and have a problem getting out of the East Coast League. And it's
Yeah.
not that they're not skilled enough. They're just, there's other aspects that help you get through that. So,
Right.
in a nutshell, I live in a really interesting world, trying to figure this out, and I like having the conversations because it's an ongoing process. I
Yeah.
still feel like I'm standing at base camp of Mount Everest and staring up, and still like kind of trudge up to base camp one, and I slide my rear end back down, and you just kind of keep trying to learn
Oh,
as
yep.
you go through it every year. It's a learning process.
Beautiful. Um, you actually were touching on a little bit of all the questions that we have, some of the fans have ready for you. Again, this show is a little more geared towards younger, not just Islander fans, but NHL fans who they know the draft, but they don't really know the draft. Like they're just coming into it here. So, from a very, shall we say, elementary version here, what's your definition of a prospect?
Well, for me, because I think a prospect, it's not just the kids who are draft eligible or going to be drafted in another year. For me, a prospect is a much larger range. So it's any player who hasn't played, who's played less than 200 pro games. So whether it's
Okay.
in the American League or whether it's in Europe, if you're under 200 pro games, I still consider you a prospect. So you could be 22 and still, let's say, have 150 games in your belt pro. I still think you're still a prospect. It's really
That's
games
interesting.
played really matters in terms of understanding. There's a games played metric. So it was something. It was a concept that I'm not sure if you're aware of, or you probably have heard it. So it's 200 plus games in 5 plus years before you start to evaluate. So
Yes.
I built that model back in 2007, and why I built it was by also a little bit accident. I was trying to figure out, like, what do you still consider a prospect? And that was conversations I had with NHL teams and executives. So what's the point where you no longer consider a player a prospect? And then I was trying to figure out, okay, what point do you feel comfortable with a player who's played X amount of NHL games? So it ended up becoming always 2.5 years. That was sort of the breaking point amongst all the conversations I've had with NHL executives, you know, uh, a- and scouts. Was that's when they started to feel more comfortable about not only the value of the player economically, but also the value of the player of him continuing to be, a very good player or a player at the NHL level. So I extrapolated. I took the 200 plus games from the NHL, and then I applied it and ran it through a bunch of different models to see if it proved out. And it seems to be around the same. So it seems to be about 200, that two and a
Okay.
half seasons. So if it's in Europe, that's actually more. It's generally could be 3 or 4, depending how many games they play.
Okay.
So that's pretty much the nutshell. Is if they played more than 200 games a pro, I don't consider them a prospect anymore. If they played more than 200 games or more as an NHL player, then that's the marker for me to saying that's a successful draft pick or that's a successful free agent signing, whether they come out of college or Europe or CHL. So those are
Okay.
really the barometers that I use to determine what's a prospect or what's a successful NHL player.
Beautiful. I, as everyone now at this point knows, I listen to your show all the time. And when you and Brad Allen talk about value, there's a value when you're ranking a prospect. What is what is it that you value? What's your mindset when you're looking at the player? What's the value of a player?
See, that's a much deeper question. So I'm gonna.
Yes.
So what I'm gonna, I'll put it out this way. So there are, in my system, I have a variety of different skills that I grade them on, and then inside of those skills are micro skills.
Okay.
So it'll be based on, you have to look at which and how you weight each of those skills. So it would be either different forms of skating, hockey sense, your puck skills, your shooting ability, any defensive awareness, offensive awareness. All of those are weighted. So
Hmm.
it's a combination of, like, obviously you have to be able to have hockey sense or you can't play. Number one, you have to be able to have a work ethic, compete, or you're not going to play. You have to be able to be at least an average skater. You don't have to be a great skater, because look at Mark Stone. Do you consider him a fast skater in terms of moving?
No.
No, but he's actually a really highly effective skater. He understands how to
Yes.
skate the game. So you got to be average in that respect. You can have some strengths and weaknesses, but average. For me, you can get away with having average puck skills and average skating, but have a high level of work ethic and a high level of hockey sense. Got to have it. Got to have it.
Beautiful.
Being a bigger body certainly helps. Now, I'm not saying that small guys can't play. They can, but the probability of you playing, especially as a defenseman, being 5'10" or smaller, there's only, I think there's 11 of them in the league. It's about 5.25% chance. So
Okay.
size is a factor, particularly defending. You also have to factor in their position that they play. So obviously, defensemen and centermen are going to be more valuable than wingers. Not
Correct.
always, because that really depends on their playing style. So I factor in playing style. So are you a sniper? Are you a playmaker? Are you a power forward? Are you a two-way forward? Offensive defenseman, two-way defenseman, defensive defenseman. But each inside of those playing styles, there are variations. So, for instance, if you're a power forward, okay, what type of power forward? Are you a shoot first? Are you a playmate, more of a playmaking, a primary playmaker as a power forward? Like, which one are you? Because I found in my study there is a value difference. So, for instance, for power forwards that are primary playmakers have a much greater propensity to play in the NHL. They have a higher probability of playing in the NHL than a primary shooter. For instance, you'll look at Matt Boldy and then look at Julian Gauthier. Matt Boldy
Hmm.
is a primary playmaker as a power forward. Gauthier is a shooter. And you look at through the draft history and you go through all the different power forwards that you would deem a power forward, not just because you have a big body. And you can find all the players that have been more successful have always been primary playmakers, because it requires, they have to be able to pass and think the game at a high speed to play in the top two lines, right? It's really about pace. It's about your decision making, how quickly you can process information, whether it's adaptable processing, which is more in a chaotic circumstance,
Right.
or a set play. So a set processing. And they're just two different processing aspects in your brain from that standpoint. Um, you will see by my list, certainly, that I will value, if I think a player is going to be a top three D man, he's going to be rated, he's going to be valued higher. Because how hard is it to find a top three defenseman? Extremely hard. Where do you normally find
Extremely
them in the
hard.
draft? If you have to go and acquire one in free agency, what does it cost you? Massive cap space and term. If you have to trade for one, the asset costs are out the roof.
Right.
So if that's in the draft, then they're going to be rated higher. Power forwards are going to be a little bit rated a little bit higher in my draft board as well, because if you hit on them, they're so rare that it's based on scarcity, economic
Right.
scarcity. There's greater value in that as well. I certainly have to. I look at other factors. Positional centermen are going to get a higher value over wingers if everything's being equal. So if they're
Right.
really close in terms of how I built my system. So what I do is I have a performance management system I've built for myself, and then I input data, whether it's my tactical scouting reports, that you go into the game in your tactical video reports, and then any biometric I can pull out, any psychological I can pull out, background information. I put all that in there, and then I press a button because everything's already weighted for me. I press a button and it spits my list out.
Right.
And then I know then like I can, if I want to, change some things. Maybe want to move one guy up if he's a defenseman over a winger, but I really don't like to touch it
Right.
because once you start touching it, my own personal biases can jump into that, and I've already
Right.
set that to try to remove as much as that as I possibly can. I
Right.
recognize I'm a human being. We all have biases. It's like
Yes.
it's okay, but the most important is to like figure out what they are, because
Right.
one of the first things I learned when you're scouting or trying to put lists together is, and then mistakes are made. Sometimes
Hmm.
you're the problem. So
Yeah.
maybe it's not the player or the team that drafted him or developed him. Sometimes it's the evaluator himself. So you always have to have that in your mind. It's sometimes you're the problem from that standpoint. So that's how I, in an overarching standpoint, that's how I value. Now, goaltenders is a whole nother thing. I fully admit
They're always a different beast.
I'm not a goaltending scout, so I do ask for help. So there's
Okay.
generally three guys that I will knock on their doors and say, okay, this is what I'm seeing. From a technical standpoint, that's where I have the most problems. But from a mental and emotional, I can evaluate a goaltender based on how he reacts to
Right.
situations. And you can start to find breadcrumbs of like, okay, here are his tendencies based in these stressful situations.
Right.
And I always like to evaluate players in like the most stressful situations. On the road, back to back nights, 3 and 4 nights, I want to know what you got left in here, right? Because
Right.
the body follows the mind, right? It's one of the things that I also taken from military is that we never rise to the occasion. We never do. It's a complete misnomer. We always fall to our level of our training. So better our training, we don't fall very far. So it's always the people who have the best training and are the most consistent and the most disciplined that can handle those situations the most effectively. You always like when they talk about the superstars are like some of the most hardest workers. It's not always just in the gym, but it's in other ways too. Like they're so well prepared that when it hits the fan, and it always does,
Right.
then they're able to mentally, emotionally handle the situation more effectively. We talk about resilience in players. And resilience is how quickly can you get to your equilibrium? So whether you're too high or too low, how quickly do you get back to that level where you're at your natural best? And
Right.
that's really for me is that resilience part is really important. And that's one of my valuations as well.
Okay. Beautiful. We have just touched on this already, but I I have pleasant arguments with some Islander fans here. Um, I usually look, and it's probably because it is the Islanders. I look at a prospect anywhere between 17 to 23 because over the last 5 years, Lou has actually drafted 17-year-olds. He's drafted 8 of them over the last 5 years.
Right.
And
Late birthdays. Yeah.
you're right. Exactly. Yeah.
For the
Exactly.
draft. Yeah.
Yeah. For the draft, but a player like Noah Dobson this year, he was 22 at the beginning of the season. He was 23. He may have been around that 200 game mark, if not maybe a little bit more. But a lot of fans were getting on his defensive skills or whatnot, and it's like he's regressed, he's done this, he's done that, and I'm like, he's still a prospect. He's still like on that term. So my question to you is there another label for someone who just may be going through a learning curve, or is he still a prospect?
Oh
Where is
no.
that person in the middle?
Like Noah Dobson, for my money, there's still a learning curve. For one thing, is that when he first comes into the league and he's playing primarily against third lines and fourth lines. So there's
Right.
like, and he's not burdened heavily. But
Okay.
year two, year three, get into year four, all of a sudden he's elevated where he has to defend against first line players and second line players on the road when they don't have the line change. And
Ah,
all of a sudden the level of what you saw of his here's the difference is people sometimes they don't always look at strength of competition. So
okay.
when you're looking at strength of competition, all of a sudden the difference between a third line player and a first line player is can be significant depending on the player offensively,
Right.
not necessarily defensively. So that's just more taxing in terms of what how he needs to defend, and how refined his defensive habits have to be. The other
Okay.
factor to consider is, and this is based on human brain development. the male human brain specifically generally doesn't finish developing until you're about 24. It's why car insurance
Wow.
companies drop their rates at 25. So basically, prior to 24, no, 24 and younger, you know what you were like at that age. I remember what I was like. We were basically hairless monkeys,
Yep.
running around, making ridiculously bad decisions, doing foolish things. Is because the frontal lobe of your brain controls higher reasoning and decision making especially under duress. So it's part of like when you see a player when they say, "Oh, he's taken his game to another level." Start to look at his age, and you start to see this theme develop as, "Oh, he's 24. Oh, he's 24.
Ah.
Oh, he's
Okay.
24. Oh, he's 25. Oh, he's like some of them are 23." It's always
Right.
in that 3-year range, but most of them are 24. It's why
Okay.
the average age for a rookie in the NHL is actually 22.9 years of age. So there's a
Beautiful.
correlation between, cognitive science and cognitive performance and what's going on the ice
Yep.
because it's such a process. It's like you start to see everything sort of settle down for players. And then, people out in the analytics world will say, well, he had produced more points at this age and, he peaked then. So now they do these, age curves that are not reflectant of what science actually says.
Right.
Like biological cognitive science says the opposite. It's because they don't account for the variable change from playing against lesser competition to greater competition. And that
I
variable
got
change is significant, particularly when you're a defenseman and defensive zone starts against a number one line of opposing team on the road. Like it's night and day.
you. Right. I got you. Beautiful. Again, we also touched on this again a few minutes ago, but when the Islanders draft a junior player from the CHL, I normally don't tend anymore to look at the numbers per se and what they're doing again in juniors because usually if they come to, let's say, the Islanders, for example, the Islanders are going to have that person work on something already. And especially down in Bridgeport, but especially in juniors, they're going to be working on something that the Islanders want them working on. But of course, the coaches there on that specific team still want them to play their regular game. So I don't look at the numbers so much during the regular season, but if they make the playoffs, that's when I really start to dial in because it's a different beast. There's a
Yeah.
little more
Uh,
pressure. It's out of their routine.
well,
It's
they're also
out of
playing
their comfort zone.
they're playing against a greater strength of competition.
Right.
Yeah,
How
and
important?
that's where junior habits become much more noticeable if a player has what we call bad junior habits. Because if you're a
Okay.
really good player on a junior team, you're out on the first line, you're on the first power play unit, you get a lot of leeway for not playing a structured 200-foot game, particularly defensively, if you're a player who can put up a lot of points.
Yep.
So we always talk in player development, and we have our guests on about breaking junior habits. Right. Yep. Gotta come in. He's, got offensive talent. Got to break some habits. Got to change some habits in him. Which is why you see a lot of this is why I don't like this rule of like having the CHL players come in at the American League at age 20, because the American League is the second base league in the world. It's a meat grinder for
Yeah,
these
we're
young
gonna get
20 year
into
olds.
that.
Like,
Yep.
how many times I've seen kids come in and their eyes are big as saucers. They're like, after 20 games, I'm like, I'll see them at the beginning of the year, or I saw them in junior. I'm like, so remember when we had the conversation about how tough the American League goes? Yeah, yeah. Nope, nope. Yeah, you're right. Because it's just like it's a wake up call for them, especially the first 20 games. It's just like they're a
Yep.
babe in the woods, or like because the talent pool compresses so hard. When you look at these American League rosters, it's just like, okay, he was a top scorer on his team in junior. He was a top scorer of his in college. Oh, he was a top two player in Europe. This guy was on the All Star team for the World Juniors. Like the whole rosters are full of guys like that, right? So you're what happens is you no longer become special. You're no longer
Right.
special, right? You're really one of the guys. So then how do you separate yourself
Right.
through that? So I always look at particularly the first couple of years of the American League is I put them in 20 game increments. Well, now it's not 80 games, so it's like 18 game increments. I'm like, what do
Sure.
they do in the first 18, then go all the way through, and then there's the playoffs, and then kind of like keep monitoring that. And especially for get back to the junior or whether it's college, 90% of my viewing is really their 5-on-5 play.
Okay.
I'm less concerned about their power play and the penalty kill, to be honest, because you can figure out how if a player would be effective as a power play on an NHL role or a penalty kill in an NHL role based on their 5-on-5 play,
Okay.
based on their hockey sense, defensive, and their habits. You can figure that out there. It's more important because if you can't perform 5-on-5, when the talent pool compresses, forget about it, man. If you're like a power play specialist, what's the likelihood
Yeah.
of you playing on a power play in the NHL level? Let's be
Not,
honest, because the
not,
coach can't
not, not
trust you
much.
anywhere else.
Right. Right.
They just
That's true.
can't, right?
No. So, um, when you're doing your drafting, I always hear the percentages, but for the fans who have not heard your show yet, the percentages of players making it from after they've been drafted to becoming a pro.
To like an NHL
We
player.
yeah, to becoming an NHL player. What are the chances?
Okay,
We know
so
they're slim.
okay, on average, and I'll use the years in the salary cap era from '06 to 15 as
Yes.
a barometer, the first 10 years, because before that, the valuation of players changed when the salary cap came in. So
Yep.
'06 to 15, on average, 58 players out of any given draft on average will play more than 200 games in the NHL. That's it. That's about 25%, a little bit over 25%. That's it. 58. That's not even at this point 2 players per team. Now, and if you want to be a contender, you have to get 2 players
Yeah.
every year, minimum. You got to get 2 players. So this year, as I went through my list, I had 60 players who I thought were going to play 200 games. And then the rest of the people on my list are what I would call call up players and then cup of coffee players,
Sure.
depending on how many games played I think they're going to play based on that. So I break it down a little bit more specifically from that standpoint. But
Perfect.
that's really it. And the teams that are in the 35 percentile efficiency range, 40 percentile range, those are the ones I really pay attention to. So the Los Angeles Kings, the Anaheim Ducks, the Washington Capitals, they're like 15 years straight. They're always in the top 5. So
Right.
I watch those teams closely because how they make decisions and the players they take, every team leaves breadcrumbs of how they make decisions and what their preferences are. So why are these teams always good? It's not a
Right.
fluke, right? There is a rhyme and reason to why they're successful. You can have a lucky year, but you can't have a
Sure.
lucky decade, right?
Right.
You can't have a lucky 15 years. It doesn't work that way, right? So obviously there's processes not only in their evaluation and then their rankings, but also in their player development strategies as well.
You and I agree that the American Hockey League right now is the second best league in the world. I was wondering where you ranked the other European leagues, the Continental Hockey League, when it comes to development of players.
Well, each league, whether it's the Swedish Elite League or Liga in Finland or the
Finland.
DEL in Germany or the Czech Extra League, all of them have advantages and disadvantages. I would say in terms of developing, like there's a difference between developing prospects. I would probably say I'd be more confident with having them in Finland and Sweden.
Okay.
Um, than Russia, but it really depends on what team you're with. Once again,
Okay.
like you can say a league, but then once again, you got to get to a team. There are certain teams in Russia that develop their players really well. The problem, what happens in the European club system is that you could be a player that goes all the way through their club system, and then you're playing at, say, for hypothetically, the Swedish Elite League, and you're playing for Modo, um,
Right.
or Djurgården, and you're just getting 10 minutes a game, 10 minutes a game, 10 minutes a game, and you're actually better off being in Allsvenskan, right?
Okay.
Or out from the Allsvenskan to the J20. J20 is a little bit more erratic, but it's really about as long as that team understands what that player needs at that time. Because sometimes what happens is guys get up and they'll play in the SHL for 50 games, but they're playing 10 minutes a game as a
Yeah,
forward.
10 minutes.
And
Right.
like that doesn't really help them. I mean, they're
Yep.
really better off playing a lower level and playing in a lot
More
of different
minutes.
situations, more
Right.
minutes, but a lot of different situations. So, power play, penalty kill, last 2 minutes of a period, last 2 minutes of a game. You need a goal, you're on the ice. You're defending a goal, you're on the ice. You got to put them in these situations so that mentally and emotionally they can prepare themselves and understand what those situations are like, so that they can remain, calm and composed, and they have confidence that they can succeed in those areas. So it's really a balancing act, and that's the conversations I have with a lot of people in the player development departments of NHL teams, is trying to manage that relationship with those teams and with the
Mhm.
player, and trying to find what's the best role for those players at that time. So it's really, unfortunately, it's like I like to tell you one league is better than the other, but it's really team dependent more than anything. Because you could have
Sure.
a team in Russia that's better than a team in Sweden in that respect, in
Sure.
terms of development, depending on the structure and who's there. I mean, the personnel there matters. I mean, because not every team or NHL team develops the same. Like, it's not equal in any way,
Right.
shape, or form.
Okay. I like that. I do. I like that. Let's turn our attention now to the actual 2023 draft. Um, I'm hearing a lot of people, experts and non-experts, telling me this is a very deep draft, something we haven't seen since like 2015. Me personally, I will take a look at this draft 5 years from now, 6 years from now, and say, okay, maybe it was a deep draft or whatnot. Um, do
So
you consider?
that's the interesting question.
Yeah, is this a
Um,
deep draft?
Well, it really depends on. There's two questions inside of that. Is it a deep draft for quality? Is it a deep draft for quantity? Now, sometimes they can be both, and sometimes they're one or the other, and sometimes they're neither. Based on my evaluation, I have it an above average in terms of quantity. So if the average is 58, I have 60 players. That's slightly above average. Now,
Okay,
quality, that's a whole nother matter. And that actually, I think that's more difficult to assess right now, because the problem is players have to be drafted, and
right,
then they got to go to these teams, then they have to be developed. So, you look at any given draft in the first round, you could have 5 or 6 players who never don't turn out to be NHL players in the first round, right?
right,
Sometimes it's as high as 8.
right,
I'll tell you a story. I was flying back from a draft, must have been about 6 years ago, and I was sitting beside an NHL scout, and I had my laptop open, and I had my list, and then I copied and pasted into another Word document, and I started re-ranking players. And he goes, "Shane, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm re-ranking the players." And he goes, "Well, why?" Because I go, "Based on who drafted them." And he goes, "Really? Interesting." I'm like, "Why?" Well, I said, "Well, not every NHL team drafts and develops equally. So if your draft, efficiency is, or development efficiency is this, and you have the same relative staff in place, well, I'm going to have to reduce the probability of that player playing 200 games based
right,
on your output. So if I
right.
thought a player had a 70% chance of playing, which is very high, like you're in the top half, in the probably 14 or 15 in the draft,
Right.
but you're drafted by a team who notoriously doesn't develop players, I may drop 20 or 30% off that. And
Right.
all of a sudden this kid's dropping into the you know early second round
Okay.
value, because based
Um,
on it's just the way it is.
yeah. Let's turn this real quick for the Islander fans here. Uh, Lou has done a decent job of drafting players who have literally fallen to his lap. Callie Adelius a couple of years ago, Atu Ratu, and even in the fourth round last year, I believe it was Isaiah George. Is there
Right.
anyone in your ranking so far? And again, I'm going to say this now for Islander fans. Islander fans have to deal with Detroit because they have 3 second round picks in a row. I think they
Right.
have Chicago, they have Arizona. Very difficult time for the Islanders with the 49th overall pick.
Right.
Is there
Well,
anyone you can see drop like we've seen a couple of years ago?
hmm
Or is
um
this solid enough where no one from that first round ranking is going to slip to 49.
No, nobody from the first round rankings. If you're in the
Thank God.
in the top 30, I don't think like my top 30. If I look
Yeah,
at my top 30,
because
maybe
Kelly Adelius was in that top 28, top
nope. I,
27,
I agree. I
like
mean,
a couple of people.
maybe maybe Theo Lindstein might. He's a
Okay,
Swedish defenseman from Brynäs, who I have at
okay,
29, and that may be somebody that is not valued as high because he's so safe. He's a
okay,
safe D man.
okay,
Um, Danny Nelson may be somebody that does. One of the goaltenders, which I always like drafting goaltenders, but that's a possibility down the road.
fair enough.
Um, there's some opportunity. There's opportunity there because it really depends what happens when you have teams in front of you like Detroit and Chicago who have multiple picks in the second round,
I hate that.
especially. What actually sometimes it's an advantage for the team right behind them. And the reason why I say this is so what teams end up doing when they have multiple picks is they start to mitigate risk. So they'll take a guy with a really high ceiling but a low floor. So they're going to swing for the fences. And
Okay,
sometimes those players aren't players that maybe you would have taken if you only had one pick. So
okay,
like you look at what Detroit and Chicago. So if you look at, what, you know, Mike Dunleavy may do in Chicago. He's the director of amateur scouting. You look at what they may do in Detroit. With Chris Draper and his crew. They have an opportunity for swing for fences. Like, hey, let's try to go
let's
get a
do it.
junior. Let's go get a junior A player and like high skill, but is going to need 3 years in college, and then
Okay,
probably a year in the American League. And let's swing for the fences and see what we can ding a second line player out of that.
sure.
So those things happen. So sometimes it's the
Okay,
guys with the higher floor that are safer that drop. So that's why I
okay,
mentioned Theo Lindstein from that standpoint. So there is some value that can be had when you have teams with multiple. It's not necessarily a bad thing
right.
because I've talked to teams in the past and I've sat in the room during when they put lists together, and there's really like if you have multiple picks, there's really a mitigation of risk. Okay,
Okay,
you know this guy has a higher floor, so we'll take him with one pick, but the next pick, let's swing for the fences if this guy is here, right?
right.
So if you had like a Brady Nadeau out of Penticton, swing for the
Okay,
fence, right?
sure.
Or his line mate Ador Suniev, a Russian, like he was like
Yes,
6'3", but can skate and hammer a puck.
right.
Hey, let's see what happens with
Let's
that
take a
kid.
shot at him.
Sure,
Okay,
right? So like there may be an opportunity at 49 for them to get a player that maybe should have been taken 10 spots higher. Now,
okay,
this is one of the caveats I always say. Like if people look at public rankings that are out there, the difference between 5 spots or 7 spots in the first round
no
is
difference.
irrelevant. Don't worry about it.
Right.
The
That I
difference
learned. Yes.
Yeah, the difference between like once you get in the second and third rounds, if like you have that long of a list, the difference between a player, if it's 15 slots different, don't worry about it. It's irrelevant. It's
Right.
really about just preferences. So this weekend show, I have myself and Jason Buchela's on, and we discuss our second round from 33 to 64. And we have some players that are pretty close within a 5 range, and then we have some other ones that are much farther apart. And we talk about what we see and what we value, and we have those conversations in between that, and we can have a intellectual conversation about it and not get mad at each other because
Right.
it's like, okay, this is just
Right.
my preference. Now
Sure.
explain your logic and the reasoning behind that and what's your argument, and then we can have intellectual discourse, which is great, right? But
Right.
then it allows for the listener to have some different perspectives of, because that's what I'm interested on our show is like just to open up
A different
conversation.
perspective.
Yeah, we
Right.
like to have kind of like a show that's like a bunch of people sitting around a table at a pub, drinking a beer, talking
That's this
hockey,
show.
right?
That's what
And
we do.
we're just gonna have we're gonna have a conversation. So, what do you think? What
Beautiful.
did you see? From where did you see that from? What's your perspective of that? Or wait a minute, you like that player? You think that player is valued? Okay, well, why? And I'm not saying it in a question to like question you. I'm
Right.
curious. How did you
Right.
evaluate that? What do you value? Because if you talk to me long enough, you'll figure out what attributes or skill sets that I value more, what positions I value more,
Right.
based on it's really mostly roster construction and economic value
Okay.
than anything, because I try to apply that into the evaluation as well. So that's what I
Okay.
find really fascinating. So I think for the Islander fans, what I've been, I look at their prospect list. It's not robust because obviously they've been trading a lot of picks away, right? So,
Right.
but they still managed to like. I thought Ruslan Ishikov had an
Yes.
excellent year in Bridgeport.
Yes.
I thought Willem Dafoe as a rookie, like out of the CHL, had an excellent year. Excellent year. Really impressed. Simon Holmstrom is starting to like move. He's starting to like push his way up. And then I thought on D, Samuel Bolduc,
Yep.
Sebastian
He just
Aho.
signed a 2 year.
You're right, and they're starting to take the next step. So when you look at Bolduc and Aho, those are your 5 and 6 defensemen coming soon, right? So, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but you got them internally, so you don't have to go into the marketplace and go and replace them. So they're
Right.
internal, right? They
Yeah.
they understand your culture. They are 100% bought into the organization. They know what Luz expects, and they're appreciated by the organization. So that has great value. So for me, even though like I look at the Islanders as an organization, and some people are sort of looking down on them because they just weren't scoring enough goals, but they're strong through
I
the middle of
refuse
the
to.
ice. They're
Hmm.
centers. They're really strong on defense. They got a great goalie. They may be able to have another goalie coming up to back up soon. We'll see. So really, where they have to push is on wing. But what's the easiest thing to get in a trade? Scoring winger,
Winger.
right? What's the easiest thing to get in a trade or free agency? Wingers. What's the
Yeah.
easiest thing to find in the draft? Wingers, right?
Wingers.
Like they've taken care of the hardest things to find, and they're not
Yep.
going to give them up. So even if they lose Scotty Mayfield, to free agency, Bolduc is the answer for that long term, right? He's
Yeah.
basically they've just been grooming him to eventually replace Scotty Mayfield. As much as I like Scotty,
Yeah.
I'll tell you a quick story about Scotty.
Go ahead.
He played at the Junior A Challenge in Penticton and for Team USA, and that was when Mikhail Grigorenko was up for the draft,
There's a
and it
name.
was a big year, and so the Russians were there, and I was doing color for that event, and I got to choose the MVP. And I chose Scott Mayfield as the MVP for the entire tournament. And the NHL scout screamed at me and yelled at me and cursed at me at the pub afterwards. Oh, Grigorenko is going to be a better player. I'm like, hey, look, like when Scott Mayfield was on the ice, he gave up 1 goal against, and it was on a
That's
power
it.
play, right? I'm like, any defenseman who can go through a whole tournament like that, be the number one D man for that unit, and play against the best players and only had 1 goal against, and it was on a power play, you're my MVP. So I told him that when I went downstairs, and then 10 years later, it sure looks much better because Grigorenko's not
Much,
in the
much
league,
better.
and
Yep.
Mayfield's like plugging along as like a really strong defensive defenseman. So
Yeah.
sometimes the blind squirrel finds a nut. So it all
That's
works out.
right. So, listen, for the Islander fans who had just heard with, Samuel Bolduc eventually replacing Scott Mayfield, before I get the brainiacs telling me Samuel Bolduc is a left-handed defenseman, Mayfield is a right. That's not what he's
Right.
talking about.
Right. It's about the style. It's not necessarily
It's about the
it's
style.
not the shooting. It's the style and the what he's going to be able to do. He's
Yep.
insulating defensive defenseman. So
Yep.
he's going to help insulate a more offensive minded puck moving transition like defenseman. So it's more about his role, not necessarily what side he shoots on.
Right.
Because that's more important. Because we're starting to see a trend a little bit with the NHL is they want to find those transitional puck moving or transporting defensemen,
Right.
but they got to insulate them with somebody. So you're starting to see more of those defensive defensemen, and you're starting to see why, like fans will yell and scream, well, why is Ben Sherratt why'd you give up that much asset for Ben Sherratt or Joel Edmondson or guys like that?
Sure.
Well, you need somebody to insulate. You need somebody to be able to break up plays, particularly in the
Yep.
playoffs. We forget. We'll go through 82 games and we'll watch the regular season and we're all happy. And we get to the playoffs and we go, oh, that's how
That's why.
hockey's played, right? And
Yes.
then you still need those like mastodons in the back, you know,
Yep.
Sasquatch coming back there and pounding the crap out of you because you have to have it. Like it's
Yep.
it's necessity, right? We can talk about how much we love the smaller skilled defensemen all we want, but they're really rare if
Yeah,
they're under like 5'10" or 5'11" or smaller. There's not as many of them, particularly 5'10". So
right.
you still need guys. Don't get me wrong. I want a skilled defenseman like anybody. If I get me a Kale
Sure.
McCarr, that'd be great. But you still need some guys who can pound some bodies and take care of business in front of the net. Because guaranteed, go talk to the goaltender for the New York Islanders and how much he likes some big bodies to clear out the crease for him. So,
No
you
doubt.
know, and
No
trust me,
doubt.
I was a D man, so nobody wanted a short, small D man that chirped and took penalties. So they want a big
Right.
D man who can clear the crease.
Absolutely. And Sebastian Aho can play right defense as well. He
Yeah,
does have the ability to play both. Are they going to do that? We don't know yet. That's another show. That's another topic for another
yeah,
show. Shane, I have one final question for you. We kind of touched on it just a little bit. I am kind of hitting a little bit of a nerve here. Should the USHL ever join the Memorial Cup? I say
yes.
yes.
Yes, 100%. I am 100% on board. It's been a topic of conversation on our show. I remember having Jeff Merrick on from Sportsnet because he's a big junior hockey fan, and we
Yep.
broached that subject and we talked about it for probably 2 segments.
Yeah.
And I had Peter Labardius on. He's a hardcore junior hockey guy. He
Yep.
agreed. I think you have a neutral site, and then you bring in the USHL. And look, to let everybody know, I worked for the USHL. I worked as a
Okay.
scout for the league. Doug Christensen, who just got the new job as commissioner for the ECAC, he was my boss, and we had talked about that subject. And they'd be interested. They would, and I think it would be
Oh,
fantastic
I
because
think it'd
then
be
we no
phenomenal.
longer have this host team nonsense. I
Yeah.
hate the host team.
Yeah.
I hate it. Right?
I
Because
mean,
what
nothing
happened?
against William DeFore guys, but yeah.
No, no. I mean, look, I don't live like I moved away. I used to live in Vancouver for the longest time. I moved out to the Maritimes to go to university here as well, and so
Okay.
I'm near St. John. I see them all the time, and they got punted in the first round,
Yeah.
and then they got to sit around for 6 weeks, and they bought their way into a tournament, and they
Yeah.
won their games because everyone else
Yeah.
was beat up.
Yeah.
Everybody was beat up and they had to go through the gauntlet to get there. And then St. John comes along, wins some games, and then they have the audacity to say that they're the best junior team in North America. I'm like, please stop talking. It's ridiculous. And this
Yeah.
isn't the first time this kind of stuff has happened.
Right.
Or host teams get wiped out like Saskatoon did, and got embarrassed. And I just don't like that. So what I like to see is the Chicago Steel go against the London Knights and
Yes.
or like the Seattle Thunderbirds and the Quebec Ramparts. Of course I would. That would be
Yes.
great. And because the USHL plays a different style. So it'd be really intriguing to throw them into the mix.
Yep.
So I've been bugging Dan McKenzie and the commissioners in the CHL, like, hey, why don't you get the USHL in there? Right. And then they
Yes.
always come back to me, wait a minute, aren't you Canadian? I'm like, yeah, but this would be great.
Yes.
But this would be great. Like,
Yes, it would.
yeah, let's put it in like a really cool location, and you could have TNT come in or ESPN on the state side, and then have TSN or Sportsnet come in and broadcast it. It'd be great. And then you know what you do is you bring in alumni from the USHL or the Dub or the Q and those
Yeah.
teams, and have them go on panels and chirp at each other. It'd be fantastic.
Well, I didn't get a chance to listen to those two segments, but just thinking out of the box here for a moment, if the USHL had a chance to go to the Memorial Cup, do you think a couple of college players would actually go to the USHL first before going to college? I mean, I know a couple of them do it
Well, I
already,
mean,
but
instead of just going right from high school into college, they would go to the
okay, yeah,
USHL route.
yeah,
Sure. I mean, honestly, I prefer I always worry about team players that go right from high school to college
okay.
because I don't know if you guys seen a lot of high school hockey. And please, if anybody's from Minnesota, don't come screaming at me with pitchforks and burning torches. But
Here we
it's
go.
not. And here we go. But like seriously, I went to a high school tournament in Minnesota. I barely got out of there with my life, because it's like yes, it's really good hockey, but it's also in comparative to junior A. It doesn't come. It's not comparative to junior A in
Right.
Canada or the states. It's not right. Like
Beautiful.
it's just not. It's like junior B level in Canada. But I mean,
Okay,
I always think it's a development in like impediment to make
okay.
because you're not playing against. I think the longer you play against the top level competition before you have to turn pro, the better. So if you can get 2 years in the USHL, then go to college and get, say, 3 years there, say you're a drafted player, and then come out,
Right.
that's ideal. Like,
Right.
I think it's great that Cutter Gauthier went back. I think Adam Fantilli should go back. Like, Logan Cooley, glad that he went back. Like, you
Yeah.
really need that extra second year. I think it's really important. If you're a player that, is like second round or later, certainly that third year is critical for your development, because
Right.
the longer you have that runway before you have to turn pro, it's a greater advantage to the player's success. If you look back in history, it's the ones that stayed a little bit longer that tend to have an easier road getting through the American Hockey League and then
Right. Especially
into
from
the
a physical
NHL.
standpoint.
Mental too.
Yeah.
Mental too, right? Like, because we really, like, if you can get a player, say he plays, 3 years in the USHL at the most, and he comes out and he's a 19-year-old going into university, he's a freshman at, say, 19, and then he's coming out at 21 or 20 or 22. That's a huge difference. It's a
Yeah.
huge difference. Like, 22-year-old comparative that went through college and junior, comparative to a CHL player coming out at 20, those extra 2 years are massive. It makes a big difference. So for me, long-winded, I would love to see the USHL come into the Memorial Cup, and it would amuse me if they won, because then, look, I grew up, right beside, like right near Kamloops, so I'm a Western
Okay.
Hockey League guy. I grew
Fair
up.
enough.
My hometown is Vernon, BC, so I'm a Junior A guy, but. Just to poke the bear, I guess, to stir the pot, just to
Yes.
see them get all rattled.
Yep.
Because honestly, I don't think people realize the USHL is on par with they're on par with the Dub, and they're not far behind the OHL. They're way better
Right.
than the Q. Way better than the Q.
Really
Oh
USHL is
yeah.
better
Oh,
than
the
the Q.
USHL is way better than the Q. They produce
Wow.
more players, better players. The Q
Okay.
does not
Is
produce a
there a
lot of
junior
players.
ranking in your opinion? Do you have a junior ranking? Like WHL,
Oh, I would say
OHL?
in terms of producing NHL prospects, it's the O, and then the Dub and the USHL
Okay.
are pretty much on even
Okay.
now, and then the Q is below that.
Okay.
Honestly,
I
like,
didn't know that.
if you put the junior A leagues, like in Canada, they probably produce the same amount of around the same amount of players as the Q does. Now there's way more teams, of course, but the Q is concentrated. There isn't a big population between Quebec and the Maritime provinces.
Okay.
It's like 10 million people. It's not a
Wow.
lot. It's really
Okay.
small, right?
Right.
So you look at that, I'm like, 10 million people. That's Sweden, right?
Yes.
And Sweden
Yeah.
pumps out way more players than the Q does. I'm
Okay.
not sure exactly what's going on in the queue. And
Okay.
since I've moved, like, I used to travel and go to the queue all the time. My wife's family's from here. I could come out and travel and watch games. But after living in the area and seeing it live more on a more regular basis, I'm like, this league isn't as good as some people think it is.
Okay.
I'm not being mean to the players. It's just that it's a
No.
population density issue,
Sure.
and and if occasionally they do lose players to Junior A. So guys will go play either in the USHL, or they'll go play in the BC or Alberta League, mostly the
Okay.
BC Junior Hockey League. So
And
that
to
sometimes
your
happens.
point, Shane, if anyone's been doing a prospect rankings this year, there's a lot of USHL players in that second round this year,
And that's
much
not
more
even
than normal.
it's not we're not even like, if we include the program into that,
Right.
you have the USA, US National Development Program, and the USHL as a collective group. They're on they could be they're rival they're not far behind the O. They're not
Yeah.
far behind the OHL.
Yeah.
So,
Beautiful.
no, I think the US, I give them a lot of credit. I think in the last 20 years, they've done remarkably well in terms of improving that league.
Right.
Especially, this is my 18th year on our show on Hockey Prospect Radio, and we've noticed a significant
Yeah.
uptick
Yeah.
in the resources they put into players, the development strategies, the quality of their coaches, quality of their staff. It's all increased a lot. I think the biggest issue for them is marketing. Like, they need to be on a regular television, and like a
They
ESPN
should.
2 or 4 or
Yes.
whatever you got to do.
Whatever.
You got to
I
get
agree.
on. They got to
Yeah.
get on. because it's not enough to be just localized, because it's a very Midwest league,
Yeah.
right? It's really kind of like, from Iowa, Nebraska over to as far as, Youngstown,
Yep.
Pennsylvania. So it's really just Midwest teams. But
Yep.
they just have to be able to. Honestly, what I think they should do, I would be knocking on NHL Network's door. I'm like, you have like middle of the afternoon, you don't have any games on, throw on a USHL game that happened the night before. Like you're like a game of the week or something, or like you could put on
We're
2 or 3 USHL games like a week. No one would, like, people would watch, because what are you
we'd
going to
watch.
watch? You're going to watch NHL. I love the people in NHL. I love EJ Raddick. He's a buddy,
Yeah.
but I don't want to watch that repeated 4 or 5 times during the day, right?
Yeah.
Like
We are running out of time, but I'm also going to throw in the AHL. Give me a
yes,
condensed game on the NHL network and promote the AHL much more, because I know you are
they don't do it
very
at all.
big on that topic.
Yeah, so me and Patrick Williams, we could bang that drum till we're dead. Kills me.
Yep.
You guys are killing me,
Yep.
man. Like, why can't I see more American League games on network? I just want people to see the game. I'll see it
Yep.
anyway. I want everybody else to see how great the American
Yep.
League. It's the second best league in the world, and no
Yep.
one knows about it. It's
No.
crazy, Paul.
No.
It's crazy.
And I continue to tell people I love where I live. From my house, you can see New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania at the same time.
Yeah,
But from a hockey standpoint, I am an hour away from the Wilkes-Barre Scranton
I know.
Penguins.
I've driven through your town.
Oh, have you? Oh,
Yeah, from on the way from Hartford into Wilkes-Barre.
yes.
Right down the highway.
Yes. Next dinner's on me, man. Anytime, come on over. Dinner's on me. I literally have access to almost every AHL team within a 2-hour drive. Hershey's
It's great.
3, but I can manage that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
The hockey is phenomenal. And Wilkes-Barre Scranton packs the place every time.
Yeah,
Every time.
they do a great job. Them and
Yeah.
Hershey,
So-
they do a great job.
Yes. Hershey. Yeah. And I'm sorry, Game 7 is tonight, isn't it?
Tonight, yep, in Coachella Valley.
In
Yeah, it's going to
Coachella
be a late
Valley.
one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Late one. I will be watching that. Shane, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been a real treat for everyone watching. Where can they follow you on social media?
Sure. We have the Twitter account, HP Radio, or at Shane Malloy. But if you want to listen to the show, so it's at HP Radio. We have podcasts is available for Hockey Prospect Radio, so you can look on any of your podcast providers. You can also go to our website of hockeyprospectradio.com. You can find the show there as well. We have a YouTube channel. So if you want to do it on YouTube, you can watch it there. If you have Sirius XM, you can listen to it there on the scheduled times, but it's also on the Sirius XM app. So if you're a subscriber, it's there as well. So we try to spread ourselves out a little bit. I've done a much better job the last couple of years of spreading out the love. My old radio host Russ Cohen used to bitch at me a lot, like, for the love of God, at least could you tweet out when the show's on, right? So I'm not a social media guy.
You've been good at that. No, you've been much better at that.
Yeah, so now it's always I'm pumping it out 2 or 3 times a week just to let everybody know it's on. So
good, beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully we can have you on again. Ladies and gentlemen, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it. I loved my time being on the show, and I'll come on anytime.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to follow Isles Talk on Twitter at Isles Talk. Follow us on Facebook, and please, please, please hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. Coming up tomorrow, I already have my wish list. Like I said, it's the 49th pick overall in the second round. I may as well throw darts blindfolded and throwing it backwards. I have no idea who the Islanders are going to pick, but if you guys have been following me the last couple of weeks, I've gone through all the prospects. So I have a wish list of 5 players. It's worked a couple of times. We'll see what happens this coming week in a week. But I will say this now: I'm hoping the Islanders, even though they're solid at center, I'm hoping Lugo's best player available. I do have, and I'll share it real quick. My hope is Anton Wahlberg. Anton Wahlberg or Maxim Sturback, the right-handed defenseman. If we're going to lose Scott Mayfield, we need another right-handed defenseman. I like those 2 players. Are they going to be there? Who knows? Like I said, Detroit is ruining any kind of mock draft that I could have in the second round Then I have Chicago. I have Arizona. I'm just going to kick back and have popcorn and watch all the drama unfold in that second round. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for coming on. Thank you once again for Shane for coming on. We are going to cover the draft. It looks like I'm going to have off on next Wednesday. So we'll cover the first round and we'll see what we can do with the second round. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Let's go Islanders and enjoy the rest of your week.